The second thing you mentioned was you need to be a reliable and trustworthy partner towards your own personnel, but also to your ventures. I think that's a nice bridge to the crazy quilt in action. I now know what it means, so Vareska will probably explain further. But it's really about building and probably now also very much maintaining and maybe even strengthening relationships that you have as a corporate venturist. So please,
and that's absolutely correct. So the crazy quilt is actually an expression that we borrowed from the literature on effectuation, which in that stream is used as a synonym for partnerships and business relationships, or ecosystem as we like to refer to it now. And when it comes to corporate venturing, this mainly pertains to relationships between corporates and startups. And as well, probably also many of you know, is that Corina and I have previously done also some work together on corporate startup relations, and we know also that corporates and startups need each other in many different ways. But I think, you know, in facing the crisis and knowing that a large extent of your portfolio, so a large extent of these startups that are in fact your more vulnerable partners have been negatively affected or are being negatively affected and need more support or money or whatever to get out of this crisis. Well, that brought up the question, to what extent do corporates actually think they have a responsibility to take there?
Yeah, and that's a question that we did in the survey, and of course we want to ask it to you again in this poll and see how this evolves. So, do corporates have a responsibility to support startups when they go through a difficult patch due to this corona or COVID-19 crisis? And of course, again, 3 answers. You can agree, disagree, and neither agree nor disagree. I've learned that I, as a moderator, need to fill up the gap now, and I will try to do so. I think.
So what do you think, Thijs?
No, I think it's people's work. I still think personal relationships, and although we get into the digital world and everything is becoming virtual, even this webinar is virtual, I still think that the personal relationships remain important, and this is the time to show whether you're really committed to a relationship or not. If you are not a trustworthy partner as a corporate venturist now, you will not be trustworthy in the future for this startup, and maybe not even for other startups, and it will hamper your strategy in the future. And I think also between physical and virtual, I think, yes, it will never become the same again. The new normal will be abnormal from the old normal, so it will be divergent. I think we will have a hybrid, but I still think in the acquaintance phase and in a crisis phase, you still need the physical and the physical presence. And I also think this is where you show your trustworthiness. If everything goes smooth, then of course you have more means to communicate and expose your trustworthiness. In the meantime, we've really filled this gap.
Well, either we have only one respondent or everyone agrees with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty clear answer, and I think it's more than N is 1.
It is anonymous, people, so...
And it's a socially acceptable answer, but I think this is an evolution that you see during the crisis. We are now 3, 4, 5 months further into the crisis, and we all have worked from home, or we have worked more with the video calls. We've worked more through webinars like these, and we see that relationships, the way we fill them in, are changing. And I think people are now also more comfortable in, yes, we should take a responsibility, and maybe it's even a response to the fact that we saw some, let's say, more negative answers in the previous 2 poll questions, and I see it as a really comforting that at least a large majority still thinks that there is a responsibility to your startups, and that corporate venturing, that's my interpretation, is here to stay and has a role even in this crisis.
And perhaps there's also now at this stage also a better understanding and awareness of what your partner actually may need from you, and what is, what are the different ways that you can provide support. So I think what's very interesting is in contrasting these results to the results from the survey, and I think the response there is not that much different in the extent that the vast majority of respondents still believes that it is the responsibility of corporates to support startups when they go through a difficult patch, and then even more respondents agreed to the statement that our company understands very well the challenges of these of the external ventures due to COVID-19. And I think, this brings an interesting question, is that because there's a difference in believing that you need to take a responsibility and actually acting upon that belief. So if we go to the next slide, then we can also see what companies have then done to help their partners, so to help particularly the startups that they work with. And what you see here in the picture is it's a little bit more complicated, or there's a little bit more information here, but the orange bars, they represent the partnerships in which equity is involved, so the corporate venture capital investments, and the blue bars represent the respondents or the responses pertaining to corporate startup relations where no equity is involved. And I think what's very interesting here is we see significant differences between the two. So when it comes to offering bridge loans or additional funding, we see that the companies that already have equity investments, that they are much more likely to actually offer that type of support than companies that have only non-equity based partnerships with startups. And if we look at the additional support, so the other types of support that can be offered, for example, bringing the startup into contact with new customers, or helping them with other types of networking relationships, or any type of let's say non-equity support that one can think of, then we clearly see that for the non-equity based relations, this is the type of help that companies typically like to offer, and they're reluctant, I would say, also to go in investing or offering loans. And so while I very much agree with what you're saying about the responsibility of corporates, we at the same time also see that companies do keep a very clear segregation, if you wish, between the different flavors of corporate venturing. So if there was made a decision not to invest in a startup before, then this is also not the time to make that investment. And I think so being a trustworthy partner, I think also has a lot to do with staying within, so making decisions that are in line with your strategy, and staying within your boundaries. And in that respect, the relationships that corporates have with startups are no different than any other personal relations. If I didn't marry with you 1 month ago, then if you're going through a difficult patch, this is also not the time to change that decision.
Thank you very much.
So what we gathered from the interviews, if you want to go to the next slide, also clearly points to the fact that companies are reluctant in mixing the different modes. So we're waiting for the next slide, please.
I don't get it. Sorry, my clicker doesn't work anymore. I hope someone at Regie...
someone is listening, perhaps. I will just keep talking. So this idea not to throw good money after bad money. So if an investment is not going as well as one would have hoped, then this is perhaps not the time to make additional investments in this relationship. But also, as I pointed out earlier, if we wouldn't have invested in a company before the crisis, we also don't want to invest now. So no mixing of different modes. Also, what we clearly see here is that companies put a priority on sustaining the current portfolio. So the focus is much more on being a reliable investor to the companies they have already invested in. Existing partners in that sense come first, as it also should be in a personal relationship, I think. And that also means that as a startup, it's a difficult time to find new external investors. And part of it has to do with what also was pointed out by you, Thijs, and also by Corina, that due to the lack of physical interaction, it's very difficult to build up trust with new partners. Although also here, I think and that also came clear through the interviews, is in the beginning, a lot of respondents would say, well, we held off on everything. We're only continuing the talks with the teams that we have met already before the start of the crisis, where also later on we did talk to people that said, well, now we see more online pitching events coming up, and we're actually also taking part in those because we want to really continue also scouting and also continue our understanding really of what's going on in the environment. And the last point, and when it comes to again the responsibility that corporates can and perhaps also should take in this situation is the rationalization of the decisions that are being made. So really focusing on sound business cases much more than the nice to haves or perhaps pet projects and stuff like that.
But that means that what you basically say is that the trustworthiness is mainly and especially now in the consistency towards your own strategy, towards your own innovation strategy, and towards your investment strategy. And maybe you can become more clearer, less of societal and strategic return, which is difficult to explain internally, but also to your startup, but more on, let's say, harder criteria, which not necessarily is a change in strategy, but a clarification. Is that?
Yeah, I think a clarification and perhaps also a bit more focus. But definitely when it comes to trustworthiness, it's also about staying true to what you really believe in and what you want to represent, both in terms of strategy as well as in the relationships you already have.
But also the focus. I think that's also a very important point, what you're mentioning. People want to be more consistent in what they do, so no sidesteps. And that's also the reason why perhaps they lower the money, because they want to do the things they want to do. They want to do it good, because they say we have to get proof points. So no, not too much all these kind of experiments or sidesteps or nice to haves.
Okay. Yeah, I hope that we don't lose too many ideas and far-fetched exotic ideas. But I think it's clear that especially in these crises, you have to be more stringent, and maybe. I hope only that it doesn't really hamper, let's say, the things that you don't know yet. And that's also part of corporate venturing, where you also, and you might call it a sidestep, but it's corporate venturing is also there to really find out and to scout and to see. And I can imagine that a crisis will make it a bit less, but I hope that it still somehow keeps a role.
No, absolutely, and I think what we're just discussing right now also follows from the fact that almost all the companies that we've spoken to reported a reduction in the budget, but particularly also a reduction in the investments that they're making at the moment.
Yeah.
So. Another, I think, interesting observation that we had doesn't. I think links particularly to the corporate responsibility, but it does link to the ecosystem in which the government plays an important role. And you've pointed out earlier that the government is already taking this role by offering financial support to companies in trouble. But I think another role that the government can take, and I know a lot of our respondents are also hoping that the government will take that role, is to combine, I would say, investments or subsidies or the support that they give with an acceleration of innovation by investing more in sustainability and energy transition. So in that sense, this also became clear from the interviews that we conducted. There's also a clear opportunity here now to really accelerate that transition that the government also is pushing for.
Perhaps that's, if you combined it with your remark, the risk that we are not creative enough or going into new areas. This is a little bit offsetting it. I think it's a positive thing. People hope that due to this COVID crisis, we know we have to do something on the energy transition, and we are delaying it as a society. And same is for the whole digitalization. So on one hand, perhaps they focus a little bit more on their core, but on the other hand, if they do reallocation, they are really speeding up those areas of digitalization, and that helps to increase the speed of innovation. And they really hope also that the government will support that, especially the areas which are really hit a lot by the COVID, that the government will combine it, not only also put smart money in it, not only money.
Yeah, and I think you point to a right thing. I'm, of course, partly part of the government, and I think the government has ideas on energy transition, innovation-based missions, energy transition. I think the role of the government cannot be to take over the complete responsibility of these new areas or of exotic ideas. I think it's still a combination. It needs to be public and it needs to be private. So I think the government should support where companies can play a role in this energy transition, and not something that is far-fetched and not relevant for companies or not relevant for corporate venturing. Yeah. So I think it needs to be a symbiosis, and I think it is possible, but these are such huge societal challenges that we need to really make them into smaller pieces that are also very tangible and get to results in the mid to long term also for corporates and then hopefully also the society at large. Mm-hmm.